Hi, my name is Siobhan McCarthy, and I chose to research music in the 50s and 60s. Music has always had a message to convey, whether it's praising God or professing one's love for another. The 50s and 60s were no exception. It was a time of great changes in the social and political aspects of life, and it bled into the music. My thesis is, popular music in the 50s and 60s was a criticism of the culture which included harsh racism, political disagreements, and the previous generation's suffocating values. Through the rhythmic and emotional styles of gospel and blues, African Americans were able to express their faith and struggle during the Civil Rights Movement. During many of the protests, in order to rally the crowd, people would come up and sing on stages. One of the most famous songs that was repeatedly covered by artists during the protests was We Shall Overcome. It included elements of gospel music as well as folk, making it one of the first biracial collaborations in music. The verse, continued to give hope that equality would someday be a reality. Another reason people wrote music about the Civil Rights Movement was to express their frustration. Louis Armstrong, a talented African-American singer and trumpeter, sang of his sadness about the treatment of blacks in the blues song Black and Blue in 1955. The lyrics,
"Even the mouse ran from my house. They laugh at you, scorn you too. What did I do to be so black and blue?" Yeah.
spoke of the shared feeling of confusion as to why others believed they deserved to have been treated so poorly. Music was frequently used as a tool in protest as well as an outlet for African Americans to express themselves during the Civil Rights Movement. Many artists advocated for world peace in the time of the Cold War and the Vietnam War. Their music helped fuel the anti-war movement. Similar to the Civil Rights Movement, songs were sung at the student-led protests that were against the arms race between the USSR and the US. Bob Dylan represented these ideas and spoke out against the Cold War in his song Masters of War. He attacked the makers of weapons of destruction and how they made money off of killing and were ignoring the value of a human life. He sang,
Fasten all the triggers for the others to fire. You sit back and watch while the death count gets higher. You hide in your mansion while the young people's blood flows out of their bodies and is buried in the mud.
while many songs were directly targeted at one specific war, some artists were against war entirely as the U.S. became more and more involved in the Vietnam War. Phil Ochs was strongly opposed to all violence, a value that many citizens were beginning to uphold. In Ochs' song, I Ain't Marchin' Anymore, a story is told of a soldier who was in every American war since the War of 1812 and begins to question if it was worth it.
It's always the old to lead us to the wars. It's always the young to fall. Now look at all we've won with the saber and the gun. Tell me, is it worth it all?
Ideas in music of world peace and of the anti-war movement were echoed in protests against the Cold War and the Vietnam War. Songwriters also wrote about topics that clashed with earlier generations' values. It brought controversial sides of humanity into the media and out in the open where most of the adults at the time did not approve of such talk. One of the biggest differences in culture between the teenagers and the adults was their views on conformity. It was imperative that people would fit in and be like everyone else in the 50s, but in the 60s, uniqueness was celebrated. Music challenged this idea by making fun of similarities between people. Malvina Reynolds in Little Boxes mocked the towns in the 50s and the houses and the people that all resembled each other. One of the more humorous verses is,
And the boys go into business and marry and raise a family in boxes made of ticky-tacky, and they all look just the same.
Also, a sexual revolution took place in the early 60s, further alienating kids from their parents. Artists were more open about discussing physical relationships than ever before. Due to this new openness about sexuality, artists like Elvis Presley were able to rise in popularity with good looks and provocative dancing. Presley's hip movements were so controversial that when he appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, they only filmed him from the waist up. Another difference in the two generations was that there was a priority shift in relationships towards love instead of money. Many songs prior to the change placed a high importance on material items. However, artists started to contrast this value and switch the order.
All you need is love.
Is an example of one of these songs. Many singers used music to try and alter the values of earlier times and promote newer, freer ones. The 50s and 60s were times of great change, and the music adapted along with it. It gave a voice to the downtrodden, the activists, and the rebellious teenagers. Overall, the culture was in opposition with popular music at the time. Artists advocated for equality for African Americans, a non-violent political position, and a higher standard for freedom of expression. It appears that they got what they wanted in time. Even now, music continues to push society towards a better future, so raise your voices, pick up your guitars, and let's make art.